Britannia is a special boat. She'd been our home, we brought our family up on board, she'd earned us a living when we chartered her, and she was part of our lives. It has been a journey that has taken us down unexpected paths. You've seen the photographs how she was a mere 20 years ago, sailing along in beautiful condition, fully equipped, just come across the Atlantic, ready to go again if she needed to. And here she is now, and this is basically 6 or 7 years of neglect when she was held by a trust that should have known better.
It was 1965. And I was 17, it was my second job after leaving school. I love being outdoors and I love swimming, and so I got a job as a lifeguard at this beautiful Art Deco open air pool at Weston.
I'd just finished an engineering apprenticeship and I needed to straighten my head. I didn't know what I wanted to do, where I wanted to be, and so I had an opportunity to be a lifeguard.
He turned up about 2 weeks after everybody else had started because he needed to finish his apprenticeship.
She was there because her father was a pilot in the RAF and he had been stationed at Locking. So it was a fairly lucky meeting, really. Well, from my point of view, whether she thinks it's that, I'm not sure.
He introduced himself as Sam and he said to me, I remember his first words were, "You better put something on, your shoulders are burning." And I thought, how bossy is he? We were just mates for the whole summer, and then I met him again about 2 months later, and we got engaged the following February and married the following July, so it was quite a whirlwind romance.
I'd always had this idea that I wanted to live on a boat. I like the freedom of it. I like the thought that you could just untie and go where you like. It was a kind of a romantic dream, I suppose.
I think Sam had always loved it. He'd always lived by the sea. I hadn't always lived by the sea. And I wanted him to be happy.
She was the biggest boat built for the Lynn fisheries at the time, being almost 60 feet long. She drew 8 feet of water, which was very deep for that part of the world. They were much, much more shallow boats. She was very fast, she was hollow-bowed, very lean shape, built for speed.
And then the war came. I think she met a German submarine and they exchanged food and drink. And I think she also rescued some German mariners as well. Then
she was sold off to the Boston fisheries where she became a power trawler. And she worked as that until 1968 when she grounded, and because she's so fine, she fell over as the tide went out. When the tide came back, it flooded her.
The owners at that time didn't have time or the money to repair her, so she was then sold to this New Zealand dentist who had her for about 5 years.
And we bought the boat off him in 1972. Well, I was brought up by the sea, and I guess I always had it in my heart that I'd love to have a boat and disappear over the horizon with it. And so, although I trained as an engineer, and I did many other things too in my 20s, it wasn't until I was 30 that the option to follow my dream actually came.
He'd spent the last 2 years when I was away in college doing the house up to sell, so we'd obviously had a plan to sell it and make some money and maybe live a bit more simply. And
so I decided one day enough was enough. I picked the phone up, resigned, gave a month's notice, and I put the phone down, and it was as though a 10-ton weight had been lifted off me, and I've never regretted that decision. We
decided to get a boat, and we wanted to get one that we could sail straight away and live on straight away, and Britannia was the second one that we looked at because she sounded interesting. She was advertised in Exchange and Mart for £2,500, I think, which we had because we just sold our house. And so we made an appointment to go and look at her.
So having driven all the way from the West Country in our Vicky's little Frog Eye Sprite, we turned up at this broken down old slipway covered in weeds and broken timbers, and there was Britannia. She was broken, all her bulwarks were smashed. There were 45-gallon drums on the deck, tarpaulins, bits of wood. She looked like a ruin. And so much so that I took one look, and I didn't even get out the car. I put the car in reverse and started to back out when the forehatch opened up and the chap shot out and said, "Mr. Samuels?" So I was kind of stuffed, really. So we stopped, got out, went aboard, looked around, horrified, but then we went down below. And from inside you could see every frame throughout the boat. There was nothing in there at all, no bulkheads, nothing. And it looked like a cathedral, and these beautiful frames, and you could see the shape of her from the inside.
Sam fell instantly in love. I was a little bit more slow. I could see she was beautiful, but then I thought, how can we possibly live on this? I'm 6 months pregnant, it's not going to work.
Looking back, of course, to get your wife who's 6 months pregnant to go and live on a wreck of a boat in a remote harbour on the east coast of England, perhaps, isn't a reflection upon my judgment. It's more a reflection upon Vicky and what a brave soul she is. Right, well, Mike, what we're doing down here, this used to be the main saloon of the boat. In here, there was a bulkhead across here, back of the cabin here, steps down, bunks either side, and seating. Everybody used to sit and yarn and drink in here. There was a bulkhead here which separated the area you're stood in, which was the galley and dining area. There was a doorway through here. The engine was under here, which was a worktop for the galley, which was 5 foot by 3 feet wide. Over there was the galley, had a full-size stove, deep freeze, plate rack storage, food, enough for 8 people for 6 days chartering. We had a large dining table with seating in around the back. Well, initially we were living in the middle of the boat, which is where we could stand up. I made 2 temporary bunks out of broken fence posts that were part of the railway sidings next to where we were moored. 2 foam mattresses that I bought from somewhere, a single burner gas ring, and 2 ex-army canvas chairs.
The boat was moored against the quay in Lowestoft, and it was tidal. So there was just a ladder in the quay wall, just an iron rung ladder to get on and off when the tide was out. And I seem to remember I didn't bother when the tide was out, I just stayed on board.
It soon dawned upon me that this wasn't the way to treat a woman who's now nearly 7 months pregnant. So we got a holiday home for the winter, rented that. Vicky had the baby, Hayden, in Yarmouth. And then she only had a few weeks maternity leave in those days. So when it was time for her to go back, she went home, lived in a flat that we got in Bristol. And my parents looked after Hayden for most of the days that she was at work. She'd pop home to feed him. And I continued getting the boat ready just for a sea trip.
So we were separated for quite a long time, actually, until the following spring, when he brought the boat round from there to Bristol. And then we gave up the flat and moved back on for quite a few years after that.
It wasn't easy. We're surrounded by water, and you've got a young child who was very active indeed. But the thing was, he soon developed a sense of belonging to his environment. He had a good sense of balance, he knew where the danger was, and actually perhaps it was safer than a child being brought up next to a main road, which a lot of children are, because he could fall in, and did twice, but only twice. We
used to go and have a bath once a week in public baths in Bedminster. They used to have, I don't think they have them anymore, but it's an indoor swimming pool, Victorian swimming pool, and they had huge, great, hot public baths, and we used to do that once a week. And we just come back from our weekly baths and got on board, clean clothes, everything nice, and he decided to swing off the gangplank and just went in the water between the quay and the boat, and it was full of filth and junk and oil. And I remember looking over the side thinking, I've just had a bath and I'm going to have to jump in that.
And then gradually, as he became more able, he never fell in again. The main worry for Vicky was the fact that he could climb like a monkey. And he could climb the throat halyards when he was just over 2.5. He could shinny up there. The ratlins are easy, swinging on ropes. And he actually, as did Gareth later on, have calluses on his hands when he was a little boy, like a workman, because he was always climbing ropes and swinging and so forth. So yeah, it had its drawbacks, but it turned both of them into very able, fit young boys that were used to the outdoors and were tough.
Well, this was mine and Gareth's cabin. We shared this room for, wow, long time. 6 years? About 6 years.
And then another year later on.
That sounds like an absolute prison sentence, doesn't it? But this was my bunk up here, and that was Gareth's there. These were all my clothes holders. This one still works properly. Yeah, there were bookshelves all around here and toys. It looked like any other kind of kids' playroom, really.
I really met Gareth for the first time here. I remember coming through that doorway behind you, and he was only, I suppose, 5 or 6 weeks old, and I used to put him to bed in here, tiny little baby in this huge bunk as it was, and suddenly he just held my eyes with his, and without blinking he stared into me for about a minute without moving his eyes, just totally stared into me, and it was as though my brain was being scraped. And then, satisfied obviously with what he saw, he carried on and blinked and wriggled, and I put him to bed and he went to sleep. But I felt I'd actually met my son for the first time that night in here. Yeah, so very valuable.
My first memory of this particular room was just before Gareth was born, and it was, I hope he doesn't mind me saying so, but of the first time that I saw my dad absolutely lose his mind with anger. And I had been given a pair of water pistols by my granddad. Dad was, so in there, that used to be the toilet.
So you'd have been 4?
4, yeah. And there's a chemical toilet in there, which was just
like a portaloo sort of thing.
Wasn't very pleasant.
Yeah.
And my granddad had given me these 2 water pistols, and I filled them up from the galley sink, which was in there at the time. And I didn't fill them up with fresh water, I just filled them up with the greasy, very liquid water that was hung around in this bowl for days. And Dad was looking after me, and he was in there on the toilet, and I was filling up my water pistols in there, and I was watching a John Wayne movie, or had been the day before at my grandparents' house, and there was a line where John Wayne bursts in through the swing doors of the saloon with his guns up and says, "Put 'em up, Buster," to somebody. And I thought this was the coolest thing ever. So I filled up my water pistols with dirty, greasy, soapy water, walked through here where Dad was on the toilet, minding his own business, booted that door as hard as I could, which swung open into his knees, smashed into his knees, which made him, and said, "Put 'em up, you bastard." Got it completely wrong, and unloaded both water pistols directly into his eyes, which made him jump up, spilling the chemical toilet all over the backs of his legs.
And the floor.
And the floor. It just swished everywhere. Blue chemicals and God knows what else all over his feet. Blinded with smashed in kneecaps. And he changed. And I hadn't seen it before, but there was an instinct in me that said, right, get out of here. And I remember just running through the boat with Dad turning into the Hulk, basically, the blue Hulk. And I remember getting up the ladder and onto the quayside where I had my getaway truck, which was a little bus that you stood on the top, and you turned the steering wheel on the top of the bus and pedalled it. I'd have been a lot quicker running, but I thought it was a vehicle would get away. And I remember looking back over my shoulder to see Dad emerging out of this forehatch here, just steam coming off him. And as I was looking over, I just pedalled off the quayside and dropped, I don't know how far it was, but directly onto my face. Problem solved. That was how to negate Dad's mood. Just put yourself in a worse position than he was.
I think I just remembered my first memory. Mum was getting me changed. I was stood on the bunk and she was stood next to it getting me changed. And I remember looking at her and I just poked her in the eye like that. Not because I wanted to hurt her, I just wanted to see what would happen. I really blinded her for like a couple of days.
I remember that.
Yeah.
She had a bandage on for ages.
Yeah.
That was nice. It's a nice story.
Yeah.
We didn't have much expense. We were able to live quite simply and just live on part-time wages. So we shared. I think he was probably one of the first men around to be a house husband. It was tougher at the beginning when the boys were little because we didn't really have any conveniences. We just had to live in a way like a third world country. You know, we had to fetch our own water, but we were pretty self-sufficient.
It wasn't easy in the beginning, but I think everybody ought to be a bit poor. It teaches you an awful lot of things about yourself and about what you really need in life. I was in Bristol. I'd gone there to rebuild a Baltic trader, and we had a few connections in Bristol, and when you turn up in a port like Bristol with an old boat like Britannia, you know, people notice. And someone who had connections to HTV realised that Britannia was the ideal boat to play the part of a revenue cutter in this upcoming film series that they were doing, and asked us if we would do it. And I said, sure.
They put two big bronze cannon from Berkeley Castle, which is in Gloucestershire, on the front of the boat, and there was, I think the opening sequence of the series was the cannon being shot and a big puff of smoke, and then the smuggler came out of the smoke. That was the start.
I always thought the best part of the series was the titles, because it showed Britannia sailing at the camera. And I managed to sail the boat so close to the camera that when the special effects man fired the cannon off the starboard bow, it blew the camera over that the film man was on. I've now got some money for the first time, a serious amount of money, and I knew that this was the moment, although I was rebuilding another boat, to rebuild Britannia. So we had Britannia lifted out alongside of her. Vicky's first notion of this was with some alarm when she heard a chainsaw fire up, and I cut one whole section of the port side of the boat out, which fell to the ground, and she could see out from inside the boat, which I thought was quite nice. It was like having French windows. But she took alarm at this, and eventually we bought a house so that we could move off whilst I finished all the work. So it took me 2 years to do the work, including building an after cabin navigation area, more fitting out down below, a better galley, and so forth and so forth. And then after that, in 1984, is when we went to Scotland.
It just got really, really busy. I hardly ever saw him. He was doing the boat, he was running a boatyard, he was restoring this other boat.
She was pretty much a boatyard widow.
Then coaching youngsters playing rugby as well, and it just got, I thought, you know, we need to stop. It's just a lifestyle change is needed.
And so Vicky had met a parent in the Steiner school where our sons went, who had told her about Canna and the possibility of a job there. So Vicky wrote off to the National Trust, and it just so happened that this job was still available.
So we just went up and had a look, and arranged to meet the National Trust people, and they gave us a probationary period of 6 months. So off we went.
Canna, well, it's a jewel of an island. It lies 25 miles off the mainland coast of Scotland. Its sisters are Rum, Muck and Egg, The Isle of Skye is about 7 miles to the north. It had 18 people. The McKinnons, who were the indigenous family, were wonderful people, some of the nicest people I've ever met. And we loved it there for 2 years.
We had to open the school. It was a little primary school in a house about 50 yards from where we lived.
It's a bit of a culture shock, one extreme to the other. But I absolutely loved it. I've no bad memories at all of living there.
Hayden had to go away to school because he was 11, coming up 12. And there wasn't obviously secondary school education there, so all the island children used to go to Fort William. And there weren't any other children on the island anyway, so I didn't like the school in Fort William. I thought it was too big. So we looked at Skye, and that was smaller, and he went there. And he went there for a year, and it was very difficult for all of us, actually, him and us. He had to live in a hostel during the week, and all the other children that were in the hostel went home at weekends, but he couldn't get home weekends because of the ferries. So he then had to live board with somebody else that he didn't know, and he didn't know anybody. We didn't know anybody in the Skye. So I think the whole episode was actually really hard for him.
It was kind of post-boat as well by then. We were all living in houses, but yeah, that was a tough time because being away, I could only come home at holidays, and I was having a rough time at school as well. I was the only English kid in the whole school, really. So I was a bit of a target there. But yeah, you know, that's kids, isn't it?
We decided to leave Canna because the boys, Hayden had gone to secondary school and on the Isle of Skye and wasn't happy. He was lonely. You know, we'd been a very tight family physically, obviously living on a boat and then living on an island. And Gareth was the only child on the island. In fact, they had an article about him in one of the papers that he was the only child in the whole of Britain that had a school and teacher all to himself. But we noticed when Hayden came back the thing that was missing in Gareth's life, and that was laughter. You know, he had nobody to play with. And although he was quite content in his way, we felt that it was important for him to have, you know, siblings. So we decided, with some difficulty, to take that move.
We sailed overnight. It was in the summer, July, August time. So it was a lovely, calm night, and we just sailed around the top end of Skye, and we saw the sun go down, we saw the stars come out, we saw the sun come up the next morning, and then just sailed into Portree Harbour quietly, and it was beautiful.
Another jump into the dark for us on a boat, sail away, no job, nothing to go to, you know, making out again, which we'd done before, so we weren't too bothered by it. Then we got to Skye and anchored.
Poor Hayden, he stayed down below for about 4 days. He wouldn't come out because he thought people would think we were gypsies.
Yeah, it's quite funny when you tell kids that you live on a boat, they sort of think you're like a gypsy or a tinker or something like that, but when they actually came down onto the boat and played on it, they were like, wow, this is the coolest thing ever, you know, it's amazing. And we used to swing around the mast. We'd go all the way to the back of the boom, which is about 40 foot long, to a rope going up to the top of the mast and jump off, and we'd swing all the way up to the bow, all the way around and land back on the boom again. And then when you swung back, you went even faster because the rope was wrapped around the mast, you see. And we used to just do this all the time. Like I was probably, 2, 3 doing that?
Something like that, yeah.
And
it's quite a trapeze act.
there's not a hope in hell I would let my kids do that. They would be petrified. Poor must have given mum kittens.
Especially and then when the boat was on legs.
Yeah, because you got a 15-foot drop off the side, haven't you?
And onto gravel.
Yeah, but when our friends would come along and go on the boat, they'd try and do it. They'd ended up smacking themselves, and they'd go back home to their parents with some sort of injury, didn't they? Because they couldn't do it.
And then we got a flat in the harbour, overlooking the harbour. So life then became easier for us. And it was at this point that we decided, well, we had to decide what we were going to do with Britannia, because here we were living ashore with a boat in the water that we couldn't afford to maintain if she wasn't our home. So that's when we took the decision to use her as a charter vessel and see if we could make a success of that. We called her Skysail Charters, a play on the word sky, of course, and Skysail is one of the top sails on a square rigger. And we were told by all and sundry that it wouldn't succeed. It was an impossible dream to run an old boat up there like that. Anyway, we did, and for 10 years we did it successfully.
We both worked full-time in the business. I did all the admin and the bookings and the customer contact, and Sam did the training of the crew and obviously all the maintenance.
It was almost like being on the wild frontier, because there were two other boats working up there that we knew, people that we knew in remote places. We used to go in and anchor, and there was always a party. And so bringing these people from the southeast of England to these raves in remote spots on the west coast of Scotland, and the whiskey and the Cayleys and the weather and the madness of it all, I'm sure they went away with amazing stories.
It was just Britannia to begin with, and then Sam met Mike Humphreys in Fort William. He was working on another traditional boat in Fort William during the winter.
He'd been sailing on our competitor's boat called Lawn Leader. She was an 80-foot Brixham trawler. But the guy who owned her, we met, Don Hind, and we became friends.
I went along as a labourer, knowing something about wood and using wood and having an interest in wood, but not actually having any boat building skills or shipwriting skills. I went along. I turned up at what has subsequently become Don's yard, and because Don had asked Sam to do the replanking on Lawn Leader that winter. So that's where I met Sam.
And the first time I saw him, he was being brought up to me by Don, who was giving me a labourer to work with me with what I was doing. And up came this wonderful, shiny little man in a well-washed pair of blue overalls, shiny brown boots, shiny brown hair, big flowing moustache. He looked a bit like Asteris, and who held out a very firm hand. And I liked him from the moment I took his hand, and we've been friends ever since.
We were halfway through doing this job, and I made noises about what a beautiful boat she was, which she was. And Sam said, "If you think this is a lovely boat, come and see what my next job." So he took me up to the Caledonian Canal. His next job was to move on to a Bristol Channel pilot cutter, which at that time was owned by someone that Sam knew on Skye, and she had been put on the Caledonian, at the bottom end of the Caledonian Canal, just a mile or so from where we were working on Lawn Leader. So he took me up to see Alpha, and she just absolutely a really beautiful Bristol Channel pilot cutter, and then at that time both Sam and Don and Vicky and Gilly were thinking of they got more business than they could deal with. They needed an extra ship, an extra sailing ship. So I thought, well, I can do that. So I'll buy Alpha, and I just borrow some money from Clydesdale Bank, buy Alpha, and we can set up. We can then jointly operate another sailing ship. So we have a fleet of classic ships in the Hebrides. There'd be Lawn Leader, Britannia, and Alpha. So that's what we decided to do, and that in fact is what we did.
But it was a disastrous route, because somebody had pulled Alpha off her legs just as he was buying her, and she got smashed. So I had to rebuild her. That took another year of my life, and that was very difficult because I was exhausted by the end of that, merely because I wanted to do the best for Mike that I could and push the work hard and work long hours, and I was worried about it because I knew it was costing him a lot of money and stuff. Anyway, we got it done, and she went sailing, and she sailed with us for the first season. We took her to the Canaries for a winter, and then he took her on and worked in opposition to us, as it were, but with us, just like Lawn Leader. So we all worked together, and we'd frequently meet up in the small hours and have a party, and best left really as a party in the small hours, I think.
We just got such wonderful memories of it. There is something magical about the Hebrides. There's something magical about old sailing ships, and there's something spiritual about it, in fairness. And for us as owners, skippers, sailors, we've got so many fantastic memories. I mean, we could bore people to death about our experiences, and I mean, some of them are comical, and some of them are it's just extraordinary.
I first went on her in 1988, and it'd be late that year, I did my first trip to Africa, to Kenya, and during this trip in Kenya, we found the way of out in the on safari. The way was trading things rather than spending money, because they had no way out in the sticks of spending money. So my Skystill Charter T-shirt went. Once you get sailing, it's absolutely magic, and then you turn the engine off and you get sailing. It's absolutely magic experience. Yeah, it's a heavy boat because it had a tiller, not a wheel. So and you have to get used to the sort of delayed response, so you tend to overcompensate, and so you're weaving a bit until you get used to it. But obviously the sails with the old ropes and wooden blocks, it's quite hard work. It needs 4 people to put the mainsail up. It's quite hard work. After I got back after a week, I used to lose the skin off my hands through not rope burn, but just the pulling, you know.
We used to go to Ireland, to Strangford Lough. We were invited to go there, where we were always the biggest boat, and we never did very well in the races because all the Galway hookers used to moor up outside of us, and the race would start, and it would take 15 minutes to get them all off, by which time the race was over pretty much. But we weren't really there for that. We were there for the crack. People loved it. We had a great time. We used to go for a 2-week trip to get down there and drink and make merry for 4 days in the festival. Always fantastic fun. The Irish were wonderful.
The last one we went to was Bristol, the Festival of the Sea in 1996, and we had a big for sale sign up then.
My parents had made some pretty serious errors. I won't go into the details of that, but let's just say that they were in danger of being thrown out their home. The house would have to be sold. So instead of that, it was better that Britannia was sold, and so that's what we did.
In order for the banks to take out a secure loan, we didn't have anything that was security. So she had to be a British registered ship on Lloyd's Register rather than a registered fishing vessel, which she had always been. And in order for her to be a British registered ship, the Queen's Royal Yacht Britannia was still in commission then, and you can't have the same name, it has to be a different name. So we came up with the idea of Spirit of Britannia.
And I sold her in the Bristol Festival of the Sea in 1996. A few days later stood on the suspension bridge at Bristol and watched her pass underneath for, I thought, the last time in my life that I'd ever see her.
Yeah, it was a bit of a wrench. I mostly felt sorry for Dad because he'd spent 23 or 24 years of his life working really hard. And it was kind of his pension fund, really, I suppose, and he had to let it go for half of what it was worth because of the financial situation that they ended up in due to helping my dad's parents out. And yeah, I was at university at the time, so I was still kind of caught up in my own life as well, but I really remember feeling very, very sorry for Dad.
I wasn't so much bothered about the loss of the boat, but I remember thinking that the circumstance in which she was sold was wrong, because it was under extreme duress, and it was to bail out somebody else financially, and she went for a pittance compared to what she was worth. I remember thinking that. I just remember thinking that it wasn't a good ending. It caused him a lot of grief, a lot of stress. So I wasn't so concerned about the boat, but I was concerned about him.
Several people had mentioned to me about her and how sorry a state she was in and what had happened. And I think when a number of coincidences happen to you in your life, that you should take notice of them. And so I did, and I phoned up various parties involved and found out exactly where she was and what she was like. And I phoned up Mum and Dad and told them about it, and I kind of knew in my heart it was the right thing to do, but I didn't want to because of the emotions that it would stir up in Dad again.
Gareth phoned up to say that he'd heard that Britannia was in a parlous condition in Brixham and swinging on a mooring there, and had been apparently for some years. Well, I knew that, I thought, well, can I really be involved again? I mean, we didn't have the money. I certainly didn't have the energy. I mean, I was then nearly 70 years old. And I didn't think I wanted to be involved. And then Hayden phoned, and then Vicky nagged me. And so in the end, we decided that we'd go and have a look. So we flew down to Bristol, went to stay with Tom, who lives near Plymouth, who was one of our skippers. And then all together the next day we went to Brixham. When we got there, I was utterly shocked by what I saw. It was as though I'd blinked once and she'd gone from the perfect boat that she'd been to this wreck, basically.
So when I went down below in Britannia, I'd been told that she'd been completely refitted down below, so she was going to be completely different. But then when we got through to the fore cabin, it was still exactly the same. It was the only part of the boat that had been left as it was when my dad built it 40 years ago. And I just stood there kind of, speechless for a good few minutes, just looking around.
They completely gutted her. So they took out all her fitting out that had been done in order to get 13 bunks in, all done in plywood, and not very well done either. The whole boat was the sort of boat you really couldn't go to sea in. It didn't have a navigation area. It was poorly kept up. It had a new cabin, a new deck, not very well fitted. And a wheel had been fitted in place of her original tiller, which she'd had all her life up until then. But the wheel only turned 70% one way and 75% the other way, so actually to steer her was almost impossible. How they took her to sea like that, I have no idea. And obviously it didn't work, and they didn't like her because they then stripped her of all her assets, her winches, her blocks. They sawed 10 feet off her mast. They put 2.5 ton of ballast on the outside of the boat. They basically raped the boat and then left her swinging on a mooring for 6 years, so that she eventually developed dry rot, and she's been knocked about. Her planking looks like she's had old barges laid alongside her, or I've no idea. But anyway, she's been roughly handled, badly treated, and that's the boat you see now.
The difference between old wooden boats and modern plastic yachts is that I feel that wooden boats have come from a living thing already, and I feel like they have a soul almost that you can feel. You know, if you're at sea and you're in a gale and you're scared and you feel things are going wrong, I would always, in Britannia, just touch a frame or an original part of her, and you just feel that everything would be all right. You know, like her spirit was saying it's okay. And yeah, so when I went to see her again in Brixham, I found an old part of her and I gave her a pat and said, "You'll be all right," you know.
I thought we had to do something. We hadn't come all that way for nothing. So I made an offer to the trust that we'd remove Britannia from Brixham and from the swinging mooring that they'd kept her on for several years to a place of safety where we could kind of make our minds up what we were going to do. And so they agreed. They said we could do that. We would have to pay for the insurance, which cost us £500. We would have to pay for everything. It would not cost them a bean. And that they, meantime, would keep her up for sale. They were trying to get £90,000 for her. and if they sold her meantime, then we'd have lost everything that we'd already done. So I agreed to all of those things. Moved her to Falmouth, first of all, an epic trip, which John Fine can tell you more about, but the boat nearly sank.
I went down there the night before and we got on board. The guys from, I think it was Trinity, were loading all the bits on that they had in their stored shed, so everything was laid along the cabin tops. And all the spars, and there was all the sails, and there was a few bits missing, but most of it was piled on and we lashed it down.
We had a team of people to take her from Brixham to Falmouth, which is probably about a 10-hour trip, round Start Point and some quite hazardous headlands where you get nasty tides and stuff like that.
We took off in good conditions. We'd waited for a high. So we went along and everything was jolly, and we had a superb 2,000 quid's worth of nav equipment. It was like watching a road, basically, you know. So we knew where we were and what was happening. And we're motoring along, and then we got to Start Point, and it was a calm day, but there was a short chop in there of, I would say, it's probably 3-foot waves, which are not very big. But it was the length between them was getting Britannia up and going back down into them. And every time she went back down, it was pumping water through the planks. When the water got reasonably deep but not above the floors, I mean, it was still sailing along fine, motoring, we started up the main bilge pump. Within 2 minutes, that blocked, but because it was down below, but maybe we should have checked it, but it didn't have a filter on it. And there was so much crap in the bilges, and it had been used as a sort of cruise quarters for the guys on Trinity. Had used it to sleep in, kind of, you know. So that was one pump gone. The RNLI guys had a couple of small Honda pumps. We started up the first one, dropped the hose into the water, and it ran for about 5 minutes and the carburetor fell off it. So we started the next one and it actually wouldn't go. We went for a few minutes and stopped as well. And so we were now down to more or less no pumps. It was discussed lightly that we may have to call on the RNLI with these two guys on board. They said that would be the most embarrassing thing. And I went down below and was just looking around for something and found a bilge pump under a bunk with the handle lying alongside it. So I put the handle in and said, "Oh, I've found a bilge pump," you know. Chucked the hose in the what's name. The other hose was going outboard anyway. And I gave it one big pull and it just fell off. It had two, probably 3-4 inch wood screws. That was all. And bilge pumps, you seriously put some effort in, you know. So another guy on board, the boat or the shipwright, we wedged this bilge pump in and slammed it in with hammers and bits of wood. And we both got on it, and that was what emptied her out. Eventually we got into Falmouth, and the embarrassing thing at Falmouth was the RNL guy, that was a very experienced guy, couldn't put it up against the wall because she wouldn't steer to the port. It just wouldn't go round, you know. And it was, we had to keep reversing off and then trying to come round again. That was a bit of a nightmare, you know.
I'd organised a team of people to take her from Falmouth to Gweek. We had to get here by 5 o'clock because that's high water. Well, all water dries out here and it goes out quite quickly. And it was the last day that we could get her here because the tides were falling away. And so the pressure was on, really, because it's a 2-hour trip. And the fog was meant to clear at 3, and it hadn't. So we thought, well, we've got to go for it.
We had these modern little catamaran hydrofoil yachts racing, clipping in front of the bow out of the fog. So we turned around, went back in. We sorted out the navigation devices that we needed, and we took off in thick fog round to this Helford River, round to Gweek here, you know.
As we got to the Helford, we knew we had only just enough water to make it all the way upriver. So we had to take all the ballast out from the stern and put it up on the bow to bring the stern up, because it draws about 8 foot. She's 8 foot deep at the stern and about 4 foot deep at the bow. So we did that, and that reduced her draft a bit, and we also put the boom right out with weights on it to heel her over to the side, so that reduced her draft as well. And we managed to get here scraping through the mud and just got alongside, and just as the tide dropped away, and the whole thing was by the skin of our teeth.
We got the boat to Gweek and had her lifted out. We had to get a crane from a big company near here because the yard crane couldn't lift her. That cost us a lot of money. When I got her out and I had a really good look at her, I realised she was in much worse condition than I'd first realised. And I also recognised that we would have to have a full survey. So a chap I knew from a long time ago, David Cox, a good wooden boat surveyor, he came and surveyed her over a 4-day period for a reduced fee, and he came to the same conclusions. And the stem was separating away from the hood ends of the planking, which is where a lot of the leaking was coming from. Garbers were being pulled away by the weight that Trinity had attached to her keel, opening her up, and again leaking. So all in all, it was a very poor survey. What I did realise then was that she could never go to sea again unless all of this work was rectified. And the only people that were going to pay for that was Trinity Sailing. And they'd be unlikely to spend any money at all on her. They hadn't in 6 years, and nothing was going to change now. The final nail in the coffin for them was the fact that the only thing that could be done was to break her up on site. And because of EU regulations, they would have to have disposed of the timber, which was considered contaminated, in a proper manner, and that would cost her tonnage £28,000. So presented with this fait accompli, if you like, of her condition and what they would have to spend in order to dispose of her, made them realise that they were against a brick wall. They had nowhere to go. And so we agreed to £1, which I gave them for the boat, and we got her back. The boat has been taken out of the water, removed to a place of safety. She's under cover. The infected timber has been taken out, so she won't decay where she is. She can sit here for years if necessary. What comes next is the identification of exactly what we need to do. We know which areas we're looking at. We've certain planks to remove to look at the internal structure. When that's been done, then we know how much planking we have to do and what basic frame rebuilding we've got to do. She's been left on a mooring, and judging by the state of her topsides, I think that she's had boats moored alongside her. She's been used almost as a mooring buoy, and you can see how knocked about her planking on the upper sides of her is so damaged. The bulwarks, much of that had gone rotten. You can see there's a long 60-foot plank there. That's out of the bulwarks. That's top quality Scottish larch, and that fortunately hasn't gone rotten, so we'll be able to fit that back on. She had about 2.5 tons of steel put on a keel, which has pulled it away from the rest of the boat. So the planks that are called the garbers, which are the first planks adjacent to the keel, have got to be taken off. We've got to have a look and see what damage has been done there and rectify that. Then replank. We'll have to replank about 400 feet of that altogether, both sides. We'll have to rebuild the bulwarks almost completely. We'll be able to save some of it, as I said. And once we've done that, we put in a new covering board, which is the plank which is adjacent to the deck, which takes the deck to the outside of the boat. When we've done that, we'll fit a new deck. I mean, she's 101 years old now. I don't see any reason why we can't put her into a condition with proper maintenance that she will not need any major work at all for 50 or 60 years if she's maintained.
Well, I'm obviously keen to muck in and do what I can as to get her up together and back in the water. I've got sufficient to keep her safe in this place with a bit to spare, but in terms of the actual bigger money, I mean, in the scheme of things, I don't think what we're looking for is really excessive money when you see other schemes around that people seem to throw money at, some of these madcap schemes.
We began to think, well, if we restore her, what will we do with her? How can we protect her down the years? And then we came up with the idea of a trust, which we formed, and then we gifted her to the trust with the idea of the trust looking after her, but no aims as to what specifically we do with her. And then Gareth came up with the idea of using her to bring attention to the pollution of the seas.
I thought, why not use Britannia as a flagship for climate change? Put an electric engine in her, use all the cutting edge solar wind technology, and she can go around taking people out to sea and showing them the beauty of where we live, and instilling the same ethos in them that I had in me. And so also I thought it would be a nice idea, because you could link that in with the heritage of going out and teaching people to fish, as she did 100 years ago by sail. But instead of fishing for fish, fish for plastic, because the oceans, we produce something like 100 million tons of plastic a year, and none of the plastic we've ever made has gone away. And it's reaching a critical point. So although what Britannia will pull out of the ocean is a drop in the ocean, it's the awareness that she'll be raising that is important.
Of course, it was like a beam of light, an electric engine, keeping her carbon neutral, and maybe giving her the most important role she's ever had.
We've had the fortune of being introduced to wonderful people through Britannia, and she still is having that knock-on effect even now. She's been giving people so many stories and laughs and things like that through the years, and even though she's not sailing, she's sat in that shed, she's still doing that. She always draws a fantastic amount of interest anywhere she goes.
I think if you are honest in your objectives, you know, we're not in it for money, we're not in it for fame or kudos, you know, we just want to do this thing that has dawned upon us after the rescue of Britannia. This has dawned upon us. We didn't think of it before. And now we see how important it is, and it is important. And if enough people make a little gesture, and this is only a little gesture, albeit a fairly difficult one for a few people, then who knows what the world could be in 100 years' time.
I'll play the old squeeze box as we sail along, with a wind in the rigging to sing me a song. Wrap me up in me oilskins and jumper, no more on the docks I'll be seen. Just tell me, old shipmates, I'm taking a trip, mates, and I'll see you someday in Fiji.